Hi there. For much of the history of philosophy in Europe, there was a close association between philosophy and religion. Religious philosophers from the Christian, Jewish, and Islamic traditions presented arguments purporting to show that it is more reasonable to believe that God exists than not. The nature of God, the nature of faith, and its relation to reason, and numerous other topics connected with religion received dedicated analysis and defense from religious philosophers. It is also important to note that many religious doctrines enjoyed political support to the point where saying the wrong things could, quite literally, get one killed. This created additional incentive to craft defenses of approved doctrines and refutations of doctrines that were labeled as heretical or otherwise in conflict with politically backed religious authorities. In some places this remains true, and there are still some places where publicly disagreeing with religious viewpoints can get you killed. Fortunately for us, the University of Akron is not one of these places. All the same, our goal here is definitely not to offend anyone's religious convictions. Rather, it is to understand and evaluate the strength of some purely philosophical arguments for and against the existence of God. You may remember that there are three possible belief attitudes it is possible to adopt regarding a claim. You can believe it, disbelieve it, or reserve judgment about it. Corresponding to this are three attitudes one can take about the existence of God. If you believe God exists, you are a theist. If you believe God does not exist, you are an atheist. And if you reserve judgment about the existence of God, you are an agnostic. Note that some people use these terms slightly differently, but this is how we're going to use them in this class. According to one influential line of thinking, there are two routes to knowledge of the existence of God: faith and reason. We're not going to say much about faith in this class, and instead are going to focus on reason, specifically on attempts to use reason, philosophical arguments, to make a case for theism, atheism, or agnosticism. The most common argument that we find across different religious traditions and in different varieties is called the cosmological argument. The idea here is that God's existence must be accepted in order to explain the creation or existence of the universe. Here's one common version of this argument. 1. Everything that exists had a cause. 2. The universe exists. 3. The universe had a cause. 4. Nothing can cause itself to exist. 5. Therefore, something other than the universe caused the universe to exist. That something must have been God. 7. Therefore, God exists and caused the universe. In philosophy, arguments are made up of premises and a conclusion. The premises list all the reasons that, taken together, are supposed to imply or give support to the conclusion. When we examine and evaluate any argument, there are two things we need to look at. First, there's the logical structure of the argument. Logic is the study of how some statements can be derived from or implied by other statements. If you want to learn more about that, I recommend taking a class in logic. For this class, I'll generally take care of the logic side of things for you. The second thing we look at when evaluating arguments is whether all the premises are true, or at least reasonable to believe. The first premise of this argument is everything that exists had a cause. Is this true? Most people are inclined to think that it is, but why? There are two main lines of support for this claim. The first is an appeal to experience. We don't observe things popping into and out of existence, out of thin air. In our experience, everything that we have ever observed coming into existence has had a cause. Keep this in mind for later, however. The second line of argument in support of the claim that everything that exists had a cause is the conviction that this is a conceptual truth, that it is somehow a logical impossibility for something to exist without a cause. Is this true? Is it really logically impossible for something to exist without a cause? Well, let's consider a classic objection to this argument. If everything had a cause, then what caused God? If it is a logical impossibility for something to exist without a cause, then God must also have had a cause. But what could this cause be? Some kind of super God? But then what caused super God? Super duper God? We will have to accept an infinite chain of gods, each creating another, until we finally reach the one that created the universe. If the reply is given that God had no cause, then the first premise of the argument is false. At best, it has to be modified to say, everything that exists had a cause except God. But it isn't clear why an exception can be made for God and not for anything else. Another line of defense here is to insist that God did have a cause, himself. God is a self-caused being. But now we see that we have to reject premise 4 of the argument, which says that nothing can cause itself to exist. So again, to rescue the argument, this premise has to be modified to say something like, nothing except God can cause itself to exist. Once again, an exception has to be built into the argument to avoid the question of what caused God. It appears that these exceptions are being proposed for no other reason than to salvage the argument against objections. This is called an ad hoc explanation, which roughly means that it is arbitrary. Another consideration arises if we turn to the question of how exactly God causes the universe to exist. The standard view is that God doesn't create the universe out of any pre-existing matter. Rather, he creates it out of nothing. If we ask how exactly he does this, no answer can be given except that this is something God has the power to do. God, and God alone, has the power to begin with nothing, and then to suddenly make it true that there is something, a universe. The defender of the argument is put in the position of holding that while it is impossible for a universe to pop into existence out of nothing, it nevertheless is possible for God to make a universe pop into existence out of nothing, even if the only account of exactly how he does it is that he just does. Another way of responding to the first cause argument is to object that it implicitly presupposes an eternity of time within which events take place as causes and effects, and that this presupposition is false. That is, when we ask what caused the universe, we presuppose that there was something that came before the universe that we can point to as its cause. But according to some cosmologists, this is erroneous. Time, they tell us, is not something that can be meaningfully talked about, distinct from space and events that take place within the universe itself. So on this view, it actually makes no sense to try to ask what happened before the universe existed. The question is like asking, what is north of the North Pole? Or what would it be like for a temperature to be colder than absolute zero? If time and space both begin to exist along with and as features of the universe itself, then it actually doesn't make sense to try to look for any pre-existing cause. A final objection to the argument we will consider to this is that there is something wrong with the concept of nothing that it invokes. What some cosmologists suggest is that if we could talk about what might have come before the universe, perhaps there was a chaotic and inherently unstable condition called a quantum vacuum state. In this condition, various uncaused, purely spontaneous events can occur. Particles and space-time bubbles can spontaneously appear and disappear. They claim that this is already supported by both theoretical considerations and some empirical observations. A consequence of this, they suggest, is that one of these spontaneous events may have mushroomed into one particular rapid expansion of space-time in an event that we refer to as the Big Bang. That is, one such event may have been the origination of the universe. An obvious response to this proposal, that the universe spontaneously arose from a quantum vacuum state, is to ask where the quantum vacuum state came from. Could it have existed eternally? Could it have had no cause? How exactly does a quantum vacuum state suddenly give rise to a universe? It seems here the answer is almost exactly the same as that given for God. It's just the kind of thing a quantum vacuum state can do. To summarize things, it doesn't look like the first cause argument has really succeeded in showing that there are objectively better reasons to think that God exists rather than not, though it must be noted that evaluation of the argument also doesn't show that it is more reasonable to think that God does not exist than that he does. This is an important point that I hope you'll keep in mind as we look at other topics in the class. The fact that an argument fails to prove its conclusion does not mean that its conclusion is false. So when we criticize an argument for a particular claim, this is not the same as criticizing the claim itself. For analogy, if you think about a criminal trial, just because the prosecution fails to prove a defendant guilty, that does not mean that the defendant is actually innocent. Not guilty is not the same as innocent. Not proved is not the same as proved wrong. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.